How's it going?
Good so far.
Good. Lovely to meet you. Great to be in person here in London.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You are most welcome. Now we're going to have a great chat today, and I think the best place to start off is setting the scene a little bit.
Yep.
And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the conversations in the public domain about the growth of AI and machine learning, I think it's a popular topic, right? It's the one that everyone wants to talk about in this space. And what it can do has grown a fair amount. In your experience, can you provide a bit of an overview for our audience, the projected rate of growth that is currently going forwards in the AI and ML space? And is there a bit of a deviation going on between what we think is growing and what actually is? Set the scene there with that bit of context, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I think the first part is what I'll talk about is what is available in the public domain. Nothing from my own experience, but there are multiple versions probably available in the public domain. But one of the things is that there's a nice report from BCG in 2018 which said that ML and AI has the potential to drive almost 10% growth in the consumer product goods industries. Then there's a report by McKinsey which says that investments in AI applications increased by 25% during 2020 and 2021. However, the challenge is there's also a report by McKinsey which is the State of AI 2020 report where they surveyed various companies, and there they state that good proportion of the top performers in the AI space mention that significant proportion of their models are underperforming. For example, almost 30% plus in the marketing space. Now, the key thing here is that it's not that ML or AI is underperforming. The interesting thing was, and which I think is true, is obviously I can't say the percentage and the number, but for sure I can say that the ML and AI, not ML and AI per se, but ML and AI applications since the pandemic or since the disruption started. And it is more about the need for reinvention of the ML applications given the disruptions that are going on, because fundamentally the consumer behavior is changing. Also, I'll just take one example. At the end of the day, ML, whatever ML we talk of, it is talking about learning from the past data and projecting the future. Now, when the COVID started, there was no past, right?
No.
And the inflationary environment that we are in today, there's rarely a past. It's a very different inflation environment from the 2000 or the recession of 2008 or the inflation of 2014 and all, when the prices did increase. So it's a fairly different thing. So there is no real past data there. And hence it goes to predicting the future of a known past to predicting the future of an unknown past. And that means it's not that it's not possible, it's just that we have to think about how to apply the ML. It cannot be the same one, and which I think is the primary reason why there's a lot of talk in the public domain of some of the ML and AI applications underperforming, which I don't think is necessarily underperformance. It's about reinvention of those to make sure that they perform. That's my perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think, as you say, in the public domain and in the main discussion, it's going to be, oh, it's the fault of AI. But actually, if we draw that back, it's nothing to do with the AI, as you're mentioning. It's far more about the data quality. Do you actually have the historic data? Do you have the training data behind it?
Yeah.
But we don't cling on to words like that. We cling on to it's AI's fault. It was overhyped. Really, really challenging, I suppose, for when you're working in this space, saying, actually, the reality is a little different. Now, you mentioned the pandemic and obviously the economic situations that we're in at the moment. I think no matter where you're watching from around the world, that's going to be the case right now. How do you see folk like yourself dealing with that challenge?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's not ML, it's more the design aspect, and design aspect becomes more important. So if you let me take one I talked about, let's take this example, and there are multiple things that are going on. One is, what I said is predicting the future of an unknown past. Now in that case, it's not about the training, because you don't have training data set really.
Yeah.
And then it becomes three types of things. What are the variables to include first? For example, when pandemic started, there were a lot of stockpiling. There were a lot of people staying in home rather than, so what data do you use? You use mobility data as a proxy, you'd use stockpiling data, so as a proxy. So variables, that's one. What additional variables or what variables to consider. Second element is what proxy variables to consider when you don't have the data. That's the reality of life, and we will be facing that more and more, my view is that. For example, when the pandemic started, there were a lot of things where we could get a lot from the digital footprint of consumers in the initial months kind of thing. That's one. And the third part is, when you are building a model, how do you give more weightage to the recent months in the last 3-4 years of data that you're building a model? Now that's interest. That was the case in 2020, but to come to 2022, when we are talking about an inflationary environment and life is slowly coming back to normal. Now, if you take the data, you need to take much more past data than the recent data, because last 2 years is a very aberration to that extent. You need to go back to the underlying growth that was before that. So if you see within the 2 years, there's an interesting change. So if you take it, it's more about variables, proxy variables, and how do you weight what data is relevant. It is fairly that. So that's how, I think, in terms of your question, how do you deal with that? There are two parts to that. I think one is about MLAI, but how do you inculcate a design thinking in the ML design? I think that's the first part. Second, I'm sure we'll talk more on that, is how do you drive a knowledge convergence of different skill sets of people? Because a data scientist alone will not be able to solve this problem. Yeah. This is more about, if you take how consumer behavior is changing, how consumer decision choice process is changing. So how do you bring a knowledge convergence of data scientists with the marketing strategy and the digital folks kind of thing, because everyone will not know everything. I think that is what will make it more successful. But that is only one example, but there are other examples also. For example, if you take with COVID, there are a lot of categories which increased in consumption because people are spending, and there are a lot of categories decreased. And now the reverse is happening, they are coming back normally.
Yeah.
The question is not about obviously demand prediction is important, but how do you go from prediction to shaping the growth? If we know that it is going to go down, which certain products are going to go down, how do you predict? And what you bring in is the principles which are there in the financial telecom industry to the CPG, or building the churn modeling is to who are likely to churn every kind of thing, and how do you shape their behavior change? You can't change everyone, of course, but you can change certain proportion, and I think that becomes important from prediction to shaping the change, or from demand prediction to demand generation. So there are a number of principles like that which you learn through as the things. But to your question, a key element is how do you drive the knowledge convergence of different sets of people, and not only data scientists?
Yeah. And I mean, from that side, is it a case that there is now a need to hire new and different people, or is it a case of bringing people in from the business to have this kind of neurodiversity of thought and background, in order to, as you say, it's not just a data science problem, it's wider than that.
Yeah, I really like the word you use, the new diversity of thought. I think that's the right word, that's what it is. And if you take, one is the reinvention of machine learning applications, which I said, that's some application. But to reinvent, you need to recalibrate the people's skill sets and expectations kind of a thing. I think that's what is that. But the challenge here is something different. I think data scientists also need to learn. They will not become a consumer insights or a consumer behavioral expert, but they need to move a little bit towards the left to understand that. And at the same time, a lot of the strategy and the insights people also need to understand a little bit on the data science people, data science and ML, because they don't need to know in depth, but if they don't know what is state of the art, what is art of the possible, they will not be able to conceptualize the applications. So I think that part, bringing together the people into a team is not difficult, because that's organizations can do. But how do you infuse your non-core skill sets a bit to drive your core? I think that's a difficult challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you've set the scene beautifully, that it's been an incredibly turbulent time. And as you say, it's peaks and troughs of everything. We think we're in a period of stability, and then something else happens. What would you encourage businesses to do, leaders and folk that are watching at home today? How do you constantly reevaluate at what you're saying there, so that you are in this process of understanding, reinventing, going back to the drawing board and making these applications of change at a relevant time? Because it could be that you're doing this, you feel like you need to be doing it every minute. If you watch the news, it certainly feels like you need to be. What would your thoughts be there?
Yeah, I think again there are probably 2 to 3 parts to that. One is, as I mentioned, with the disruptions, and disruptions will continue in different form and shape, as you mentioned. With the disruptions, anyway, the models need to be re-evaluated because most of these models are running on a weekly, daily, monthly basis. When the models don't perform well, you need to question ourselves and not necessarily find a challenge in the model, but to find a challenge in the design and think through that. Yeah. So it's a more broader thinking to that. So we'll always uncover that. So most of what I'm saying today, it's all learning through the process, because otherwise, I'm sure if you'd asked these examples 2 years back, I wouldn't be able to say that. That's a reality of life. So that's the first part, is a constant re-evaluation of a model, which is anyway most part of the ML AI. But if the model is underperforming, rather than always going to the ML algorithm as the problem, yes, that could be, we should look at that, look at some of the design principles, and that's what I mentioned. That is one of the key things. The other part is also, one is need for reinvention due to the disruption. But as there are other things also, not only disruption, as the regulatory environment is changing, things are evolving, we need to do things differently. For example, there is a whole discussion around big data versus small data. But reality with that is, what is going to become is, it's big data enriched from small data, because you're not going to have enough big data. You can have 10 million or 1 billion profiles, but only with name and or only email ID, that doesn't help, right? You need a lot. But you can't get a lot of details at that level. You might get it at only at 10,000, 100,000 customers. How do you move from that 100,000 project to that 10 million? So it is that the regulatory environment also, as an example, is going to, and then we are going to think of new applications to drive that. So that's another type of thing, which is not by disruption, but constant evaluation. The other type is where machine learning capabilities and AI capabilities are going to evolve, and they are evolving. For example, the whole space around interpretable AI, because a lot of the machine learning applications are very good on predictive, but not on diagnostic. You cannot get the diagnostic from that, but you need to build a lot of other smaller models to augment that, to give the business the reason to believe in the model beyond the prediction. And for that, those new capabilities are constantly being developed. So those are the different types of things. But it is about constantly evaluating your model and questioning through design thinking that what is wrong. That's one. Second is, as the regulatory environment of others are changing, how do you get to the answers in a different way? There are always solutions, creative solutions. And the third is always update ourselves constantly on the evolution that is happening in the academic and commercial circles, and bring that in one way or the other. So it's a constant learning process.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if there's ever a kind of an underlying thing of the people I sit down with, it is that case of being really passionate about learning, understanding. I mean, coming to events like this where you are, seeking to hear what is going on for other people and how you can learn from that, for sure. When it comes to, and you mentioned there about kind of there's always something going on in terms of this turbulent time. What's your opinion on having industry-specific knowledge as well? Because I think there's always going to be an undercurrent of things that go on, but there'll be industry-specific spikes that you need to pay attention to that's going to impact you maybe a bit differently. What's your thoughts there?
I think it's a very interesting question, because I always say that there is homogeneity in the heterogeneity. So there is industry-specific, but there is a lot of cross-industry learning. So let me take some examples. As I mentioned, like the whole thing around churn and all, which is very common in financial and telecom for decades. It applies to consumer product goods now, and it can be done because of the data infrastructure changing. A lot of the data privacy issues, which I'm definitely not an expert and I can't speak much on, but if you take, there are similarities between financial and life sciences sector. So there are similarities between, or even some of the ways early warning signals are detected in consumer product goods, that does go into even the healthcare sector, not in a consumer healthcare sector. So there are lots of similarities where we can learn from each other, and what others have done for many more years, and what is coming into a new industry, we can learn from that. So I think there is homogeneity that one can learn from. Obviously, there will be a heterogeneity. There will be the amount of privacy in a healthcare sector surpasses anything else, kind of a thing. So, which will always be there, and you will always need certain domain experts to drive that. But the question is, along with the domain experts, which is your core set of people, is it better to infuse people from other industries but with the skill set to drive that exactly to your point, diversity in thinking.
Yeah, yeah. Now, on that point of your industry as well, I wonder if you could shed some lights on what the biggest myths are regarding applying ML to retail media measurement.
Yeah, that's interesting, which is one of the things is that there is a misnomer that retail media drives only short-term sales, which is, immediate, and that's what it is for. But retail media does also contribute to building brands and drive the long-term sales also. May not be as much as some of the other media, but it does. So I wouldn't say that we know everything about it, but we definitely would say we are working towards and getting establishing. But the key point is that, to your point, it is a myth that it is only the short-term sales. And unless you build those models, you wouldn't know the answer to that.
Yeah, for sure. I very often at this stage of the interview will ask you to kind of bring out a crystal ball and to look into the future. Now, when it comes to the disruptive challenges that we've been going through, when it comes to reinventing, as you say, which I love the word of, what are you really excited about when it comes to the future? If we get this right, what we've been talking about today, if we work through those challenges, what are you excited to achieve?
Yeah, I think what I'm excited is this whole convergence of data science. So when I say ML, I am talking data science in broad sense, convergence of data science with insights and strategy. I think that's what I'm more excited about, where old people like me can bring some of the skill sets of what we started off in many back with insights and strategy and moved over to data science and bring that convergence. And I think that's becoming more and more critical to shape things up. And that's what I'm interested more about it. And the second bit is that I think the disruptions brings excitement and challenges, because with the challenges you find that there's a need for a solution. And the solution is often not a rocket science. Solution is just about thinking about a bit rather than churning out things. Yeah. I think those are the two things I'm more excited about.
Yeah, I love what you say there about it's not often rocket science, because I think there is a bit of a trend in the market at the moment to everyone wants to run towards AI, ML and do the most sexy, fancy thing. But actually, as you say there, a lot of the challenges we do face in business, actually you can probably come back and do something far more simple and meet that business demand.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not that AI ML is going away. With the AI ML application side, I mean, you are just enhancing or augmenting them to make it much more relevant. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. How do you have that conversation with the business when they're knocking on the door and they're wanting something more advanced, but actually you're saying that it doesn't need to be all the bells and whistles? How do you manage that? Because you also, obviously, you want them innovating, you want them pushing as far as they can. How are you handling that conversation?
But I think when the business is asking, if we give them the answers to the business, then it's a question of how do you create the answers is your recipe, right? And as long as because the recipe has enough bells and whistles kind of thing, it's a question of if the recipe has all the bells and whistles but it's not tasting good, then I don't think the business will come back. I think ultimately it comes back to that, is the recipe addressing the business question? And only the bells and whistles will not necessarily always, will address a lot of times, but will not necessarily address all the times the business questions. I think when the questions are answered and business sees the benefits of it, they automatically come back. And as there's a saying, good work brings in more good work. I think that's I think that goes true.
Oh, fantastic quote there. And I love the description visually of the recipe, because as you say, you don't need to know what's going on in the kitchen. As soon as that meal comes down, it doesn't matter if it was sliced and diced by the head chef versus down with the sous chef.
Yeah, I think the role of the data science ML expert is more of the chef kind of thing, or the whole team is right.
Yeah, for sure. Last question for the audience. I always like to try and get people like yourselves to give a piece of advice or a key learning or something to be thinking and digesting as they finish this session with us here today. What would you like them to go away thinking about from our conversation?
I think probably I'll go back to where we started the discussion of. Always go back to the first principles. That is, in my case, it will be what is the consumer behavior? How is the consumer decision choice processing? And hence, what do we need to do? And hence what the ML needs to do rather than what the ML has been done before. I think that's what I would say, bring in the first principles more to the whole world of ML AI.
Absolutely awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.